Here we are. Season 1, Episode 12 already. I can hear Ghost Rifter in the background. Must be time for another episode of Career Coaching After Hours. It's me, your host and producer, John Davidson. All right, well, thank you very much for joining me. Hard to believe it's November 2024 already. So again, thank you very much for joining me. I'll relax the music here just a little bit, so I appreciate you joining me. And this episode is an extension, somewhat as usual, of an article that I wrote recently about the GeekWire 200. And GeekWire is a great online publication that you could say helps define the Puget Sound and the Pacific Northwest, not just employers or the tech scene, but great source for news that I think sometimes gets overshadowed by the Seattle Times or King 5 or Cairo or Como, our big news stations and the newspaper of record here in our area. So without further ado, it is time to geek. And I hope you like the artwork. I worked very hard on it. Thank you very much, Microsoft designer and the art department. As usual, this series is me yakking into a microphone, so it's me expanding or meditating on some of the topics that come up in my sessions with clients. As you may already know, I am a career coach, career counselor, based here in the Seattle area. My credentials are down towards the end of the presentation. Feel free to look me up. And so these are plugged in, but also unplugged. So you will see that and hear that, yes, I do have music going. So I hope this is somewhat calming. Not a lot of jump scares or clickbait in the series. And classic disclaimers before I get rolling too far. Likely, I'm not your career coach, so I'm offering some ideas and thoughts, but nothing specific as far as advice for you. Consider consulting someone one-on-one. And as always, to the best of my knowledge, applies to all of my slides and commentary. Of course, check your sources. Like I say, feel free to take a look at my credentials and some of the citations that I make. Or if you'd like to check out the article that this was based on, you can find that through Medium or my LinkedIn profile or Facebook, what have you, X or Twitter. Across the board, you'll find me on social media. Time to geek. And so we'll talk a little bit about GeekWire. I thought this was a really neat example of kind of branding. You could say the GeekWire 200 is probably their best known creation. Certainly GeekWire tracks things like layoffs and other tech news, kind of good, bad, and ugly. But you could say it's their best known ranking. And I think it's interesting to talk about it in the context of Seattle as one of the tech heaviest cities in the world. I think probably most of us could agree that Seattle probably belongs on any top 5 or on any top 10 list of most tech heavy or tech centered cities in the world. I think that's probably fair to say. But it's also frequently on lists that are noting things like best educated populaces, or even one of the best places to live generally, or most livable places. So I think Seattle's a pretty special place. I've lived in other cities, other parts of the country, so I might be a little bit biased, but overall, pretty cool place to live. And yet, frequently, if you ask somebody who lives in the state of Washington, or maybe the Pacific Northwest or Seattle, what is it like? So often we hear this common theme of people talking about some of the big employers. So is it rainy in Seattle? Sure, yes. Is it on the West Coast? Yes, absolutely. And you've got lots of great cultural institutions like the University of Washington, naval bases, Joint Base Lewis McChord. Great place to live and work. Really important strategically, but a lot of folks will start to rattle on as far as employers that are based here. Microsoft, Boeing, and Nike, and Amazon, and on and on. Nordstrom, REI, Micron over in Idaho. So fair to say, the PNW, whether you think of it as Washington, Oregon, Idaho, or if you think about it maybe a little bit more expansively to include Canada and British Columbia. So we'll dig deep in here a little bit, but I think it's important to look back a little bit that you could say Seattle used to be a little bit more of a two newspaper town, quote unquote. We used to have the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. And so essentially out of the ashes came GeekWire. So if you want to learn a little bit more about GeekWire, I think it's an interesting story about news in Seattle and how we consume news in this part of the world, where you've got, of course, Microsoft, who partnered up with NBC back in the day for MSNBC, or the fact that Microsoft has purchased LinkedIn, and there's been some really interesting consolidation in the media, not just Elon Musk buying Twitter and then calling it X. So there's that. But I think GeekWire is a pretty good, solid source of information. And I think if you juxtapose it up against the Seattle Times or Puget Sound Business Journal, you certainly get some interesting perspectives. So it has been a minute since I've written about the GeekWire 200, so I thought it was time to get back to it. Of course, this episode didn't pop out of a vacuum. It's an ongoing list that I elbow a lot of my clients to take a look at, whether they're in tech or not, or whether they'd consider working for a startup or not, kind of thing. Really cutting edge type of firms. So yeah, feel free to take a look at the larger article there on Medium. I'll just put in a shameless plug for my LinkedIn profile and my Medium profile. There we go. When I'm not YouTubing. But maybe it's fair to say that as far as a list like the GeekWire 200, does it represent the true spirit of the Pacific Northwest? I think you could make a pretty good argument that that's true or reasonable. So officially, I'll read this one out. The list is a ranked index of PNW startups using public data to identify fast-growing companies. The quarterly ranking is generated from GeekWire's Startup List, a comprehensive directory of the region's tech startups. And so I think it's fair as a caveat to point out these are firms that are not in someone's basement. So this is sort of the 2.0, 3.0 version of the firm. Certainly this isn't Jeff Bezos in his garage in Bellevue. This is a little bit more mature. So my check here of some of these firms, many of them had jobs hiring open on their websites there. So don't quote me on every single one of them, but these might be employers where you could possibly be an investor or an employee, which is pretty cool. So what about PNWs? And so this is part of my article here is, maybe these are the firms that really are on that edge and they're plugged into the spirit of the PNW. And what we have here is an ecosystem here in the Seattle area and the Pacific Northwest, as in, why was Microsoft essentially relocated to this area? Why did Jeff Bezos decide to start Amazon here? What did they want to tap into? And I think it's fair to say that we've got a solid amount of brain power, tech investors, people who want to expand, do something new, that maybe the Pacific Northwest isn't on the fringe, but maybe we're still kind of out there as an alternative to Silicon Valley. My adorable quote here, a world-class region that still feels out there and yet maybe is a little cooler than Silicon Valley. As in literally colder, but yeah, also cooler. You might have heard of our music scene. Might be a big deal. And so every once in a while, I'll throw this phrase out, bleeding edge versus cutting edge. So if you take a look, for example, at the top 10 list here, really interesting. But I think maybe even more interesting is if you're willing to dig deep in the list, certainly it's searchable by category, by industry. And in a way, maybe it's an interesting sign of the times, the zeitgeist. Some of these categories maybe represent a total shift in terms of where we've gone and where we're going. So you'll see categories like 3D printing, wearables, AI, of course, which is, I think, around 30 or so of the entrants, so dozens of them focused on AI, augmented reality, and I still love it when folks try to explain to me augmented reality versus virtual reality. They are different. I'm starting to get it. But cloud, crypto, and clean tech, IoT, robotics, blockchain, and even cannabis and automotive. So you'll see this really interesting range of different types of employers. And so perhaps if you're thinking about even a career path or a shift, might be interesting to look at this list and see what's really shaking up all of these different industries. And so one thing I might want to point out that I don't think I touched on in the article all that well, that these are firms that aren't necessarily the next anything. So it might be easy to say, this is the next Microsoft, this is the next Amazon, this is the next Boeing, this is the next Intel or Nike or what have you. I don't think it's that simple. That these are organizations on the bleeding edge, not even the cutting edge. They don't have to be the next anything to be fair to them. And so you've got one of my favorites right there on your screen, Helion, for example. Not doing fission, but nuclear fusion, clean energy. And by the way, Helion, I still want a site visit there in Everett. Please invite me. But you'll see them right in the same top 10 as OfferUp, which I think is a pretty cool alternative to Craigslist, by the way. So I may be biased. I may have used the services of some of these firms. It's quite possible. By the way, if you'd like, feel free to explain to me again the difference between fission and fusion. I think I'm starting to get it. We can only hope. So in my article, I kind of pointed out that a list like this could be just as useful for maybe anyone who's in tech, or maybe anybody who lives on the West Coast, perhaps, or anywhere in the United States or the world, being that Seattle is such a bellwether, and the PNW as a way to think about tech beyond borders. This might be a great list to look at if you're maybe a new grad, maybe fresh out of high school, fresh out of college, fresh out of grad school. Or if you're thinking about a shift to something else. Let's say you're tired of being an astronaut or a teacher. There might be a new frontier in a whole different area. So lots of things to think about. And again, I really applaud the list and the editors of GeekWire for adjusting this quarterly and re-engineering the list and recalibrating it as needed, and to think about it maybe expansively. So for example, perhaps some of us can remember when we learned about the Fortune Global 500. So not just the classic Fortune 500, which ranks firms here in the United States, but to start to think about a list beyond borders. We live in a global world. So again, I like to nudge folks to think about that list too, but I've also worked for a Fortune Global 500, so I might just be a little bit biased. So I think the list is useful to a fair number of populations. Feel free to check it out. Let me know what you think in the comments. Please comment and like and subscribe. I love to hear the comments. So is it true the PNW is a great place to live? I think so. And work, usually. Sure, we have items in the news about Boeing and Amazon and return to work and big shifts in aerospace and manufacturing and layoffs, and we hear the good and the bad and the ugly in the news, certainly. But I think a useful list to keep an eye on. And so I hope you found that really interesting and useful. I'm keeping it short, trying to keep these all to 30 minutes or less. But definitely thank you for joining me. I appreciate it. Let me know if you think I'm on target or off base. Absolutely feel free to fire back with a message here on YouTube. But I do want to share a couple of other images here. Again, thank you so much, Microsoft Designer, for helping me with the art, because it frankly saves me money from having to have an art department on staff. But when I was building some of these images, I was trying to capture the sense of the Pacific Northwest and tech. And so interesting that virtually every image features kind of these interesting juxtapositions. Got to have coffee in there, got to have lots of laptops. So pretty interesting images. So there's that. Even when we put Yoda ears on folks and all of that. I cannot vouch for whether or not Microsoft Designer is in fact utilizing edible gummies in the creation of some of this art. So here's some of my sources typically cited. Whether I use them all every episode, not necessarily. Feel free to send me an email. There's the main office number. Check out my websites there, olympicresume.com or architectinfinity.com. And thank you so much, Ghost Rifter, for providing the calm music. Appreciate it. Support Ghost Rifter. Absolutely. They appreciate that. There's their Bandcamp info. And of course, thank you, clients, supporters, students, and you, the viewers. Special shout out. This episode is the beneficiary of my new SteelSeries Alias microphone setup and the Sonar software. So hopefully that's coming along nicely. Again, thank you all. We'll see you on the next episode. Happy holidays. Take care of yourselves. All right. Signing out.